During our inheritance meeting in Los Angeles, the rain lashed against the windows. The lawyer handed my older brother a thick folder containing the deeds to our parents' multi-million-dollar business. I received a single, thin envelope holding the deed to a barren desert lot. My brother smirked across the mahogany table. He threw the envelope at my chest and laughed, declaring that a total failure like me only deserved worthless dirt. The only sound from me was a slow, calm exhale. 5 years later, the wind howled through his foreclosed business headquarters. He came begging for my property, but a solar energy CEO walked in instead, holding a certified bank statement. My barren lot had just been sold for $15 million. Before I tell you how I walked out those oak doors, hit like, subscribe, tell me your age in the comments, and welcome back to my channel. I was 28 years old, working as a financial auditor for a mid-sized firm downtown. My brother Julian was 34. We sat in a sterile conference room on the 42nd floor of a Century City law firm. The rain was steady outside the glass. Inside the room, the only sounds were the scratching of the lawyer's fountain pen and the heavy breathing of my brother. Our parents had built a regional logistics company from the ground up. It was valued at just over $6 million. They operated a fleet of diesel trucks and managed 3 large warehouses. I knew the numbers because I had audited their books for free every tax season since I passed my licensing exam. I knew the profit margins. I knew their debt-to-income ratio. The lawyer cleared his throat. He handed Julian a blue leather-bound binder. It contained the operating agreements, the vehicle titles, and the commercial real estate deeds. Julian placed his hands flat on the table. He did not look surprised. Then the lawyer slid a thin manila envelope across the polished wood toward me. I opened it. There was a single sheet of paper inside. It was a grant deed for 500 acres of undeveloped land in the Mojave Desert. No water rights. No paved access roads. Just sand and scrub brush. Julian leaned back in his leather chair. The leather creaked. He looked at me with a calm, pragmatic expression. He did not yell. He simply stated that I had abandoned the family business to go to college and work in a corporate office. He said he had sacrificed his 20s managing the warehouse floors, dealing with drivers, and keeping the supply chain moving. He looked me in the eye and said actions have financial realities. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just listened to the rain hitting the glass. I calculated the raw value of his inheritance versus mine. He walked away with a thriving corporate entity. I walked away with a tax liability. This is where I made my mistake. I let pride override my training. An auditor is taught to look at the data objectively. But sitting in that chair, feeling the weight of the thin paper in my hand, I felt a deep, sharp sting of rejection. I wanted to force the issue. I wanted a judge to look at the imbalance and declare it invalid. I walked out of that building and drove straight to a probate litigation specialist. I signed a retainer agreement that required a $15,000 upfront deposit. I initiated a formal contest of the will, citing undue influence. For 6 months, I bled money. The legal system does not care about fairness. It cares about documentation. Julian's lawyers buried me in discovery requests and procedural delays. My attorney charged me $400 an hour to read emails. I watched my savings account drain from $45,000 down to nothing. The judge dismissed my case on a Tuesday morning. The ruling was brief and decisive. The will was sound. My parents had the legal right to distribute their assets however they saw fit. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot. The engine was off. I looked at my bank balance on my phone screen. I had $112 left. I had a credit card, maxed out from paying legal filing fees. And I had the deed to 500 acres of dirt. My pride had cost me my financial security. Julian had not destroyed me. I had done it to myself by fighting a battle on his terms. I took a deep breath. I put my phone in the glove compartment. I realized right then that I could either file for bankruptcy, or I could figure out how to make the desert pay. I drove east on Interstate 15 until the pavement gave way to cracked asphalt. I pulled my sedan onto the shoulder of a nameless dirt road. The dashboard temperature read 104 degrees. I stepped out into the dry heat of the Mojave Desert. There was no welcome sign. There was just a rusted wire fence stretching across an ocean of baked earth and brittle sagebrush. This was my inheritance. 500 acres of geographic isolation. I walked 50 paces onto the property. The ground crunched under my shoes. I looked at the horizon. There were no power lines. There was no municipal water source. It was a barren grid square on a county map. A county notice of default arrived 3 weeks later. Our parents had ignored years of unpaid environmental assessment liens on the lot. The county demanded $14,000 in back taxes by November. My bank account held $112. The math was fatal. I had 4 months to generate revenue from dirt, or the state would seize the asset. I stopped acting like a grieving daughter and started acting like a forensic auditor. I took a week of unpaid leave from my accounting firm. I drove to the San Bernardino County Hall of Records. I paid $12 for a day pass to the municipal archives. Most people look at land and see what is on the surface. An auditor looks at land and sees the invisible architecture of zoning codes and utility easements. I requested boxes of physical files dating back 20 years. I read through regional development drafts, water basin allocations, and highway expansion proposals. I drank cheap black coffee and scanned thousands of pages of municipal jargon. On the 4th day, I found a document buried in a 2014 environmental impact report. It was a dormant state proposal for a high-voltage transmission corridor. California had drafted a preliminary grid map for a renewable energy pipeline. The project had lost funding and stalled out in committee a decade ago. I placed my finger on the faded blueprint. The proposed utility corridor ran directly through the center of my 500 acres. It was a geographic choke point. If the state ever resurrected that power grid, they would have to cross my dirt to connect the desert solar farms to the Los Angeles basin. Finding the document was not a victory. It was just a premise. I needed to reclassify my land from agricultural zoning to commercial utility development. I compiled a 40-page application. I paid the non-refundable $800 filing fee. I submitted the binder to the Regional Planning Commission on a Tuesday. 2 weeks later, the clerk mailed it back. A bright red stamp covered the front page. Denied. The attached letter cited inadequate infrastructure support and vague local opposition. I drove back to the planning office to request a formal hearing. While waiting at the reception desk, I glanced at the public visitor log on the counter. There was a familiar signature from 3 days prior. Julian. My brother did not just run warehouses. He ran a fleet of 200 commercial trucks that paid heavy highway use fees to this specific district. He regularly sponsored the charity golf tournaments hosted by the zoning commissioners. Julian had leverage here. He was using his political capital to quietly suffocate my rezoning application. He genuinely believed he was teaching me a lesson about the real world. He wanted me to default on the November tax deadline. He planned to buy the foreclosed land at public auction for a fraction of its worth, thereby saving me from my own stubbornness while securing the asset for his portfolio. The realization was cold. Screaming at him would accomplish nothing. Confrontation is a luxury for people with leverage. I had zero leverage. I only had work. The obsession began to consume my life. I turned our apartment dining table into a war room covered in topographical maps and legal statutes. My fiancé, David, watched me change. David was a structural engineer. He built his life on predictability and solid foundations. We had been planning a wedding for 2 years. Now he was watching me max out my remaining credit limit to hire an independent topographical surveyor. I stopped sleeping through the night. I stopped asking David about his day. When he tried to talk about our future, my responses were brief and transactional. I viewed every conversation as a distraction from the county deadlines. One evening, in late September, I came home to find 2 suitcases by the front door. David was standing in the kitchen. He did not raise his voice. He calmly stated that he could not tie his future to an obsession. He said I was turning into a machine, calculating every interaction like a line item on a spreadsheet. He handed me his spare apartment key. I did not beg him to stay. I accepted the metal key. I sat in the dark and listened to the front door click shut. The silence he left behind in the apartment was heavy. I held the cold metal key in my hand and took a long, deep breath to swallow the tears forming in my throat. I processed the heartbreak the only way I knew how. I reached out, clicked on the desk lamp, and turned back to my zoning files. November was approaching. The $14,000 tax bill loomed. My daytime auditor salary barely covered rent and the surveyor fees. I needed immediate cash flow. I applied for a secondary job at a refrigerated grocery distribution center on the outskirts of the city. I worked my corporate auditing job from 8 in the morning until 5 in the evening. I drove to the warehouse and worked the inventory shift from 8 at night until 2 in the morning. I spent 6 hours a night in a 30-degree freezer holding a clipboard. I counted pallets of frozen meat and dairy. I wore 2 layers of thermal clothing, but the industrial cold still cracked the skin on my knuckles. I slept 4 hours a night on a foam mattress pad. I drank tap water and ate cheap rice to save every spare dollar. I deposited every warehouse paycheck into a separate tax escrow account. I paid the back taxes in full 2 days before the deadline. Julian called me the next morning. I watched his name flash on my phone screen. I did not answer. I let it ring. I realized that fighting the County Planning Commission was a waste of resources, while Julian held the political advantage. I needed a different strategy. I stopped asking for permission to build. I started building a legal fortress. I spent the next 2 years quietly purchasing cheap lease options on the subsurface mineral rights from a defunct mining firm. I financed the monthly installment payments using my warehouse overtime pay. I filed preemptive environmental conservation restrictions on the western edge of my own property, citing the presence of a protected desert tortoise habitat. I submitted federal aeronautical clearance requests for hypothetical structures. I was not developing the land. I was wrapping it in a suffocating web of bureaucratic red tape. If Julian or the county ever tried to seize the tract through eminent domain, they would have to untangle years of federal environmental protections and subsurface mineral claims. I fortified my barren dirt with paperwork. I became a ghost to my family. I ignored the holiday invitations. I missed the birthdays. I embraced the absolute silent focus required for survival. I waited in the cold, knowing the market would eventually have to shift. 48 months passed. The economic landscape of Southern California did not just change. It fractured. The state legislature passed a sweeping environmental logistics mandate. It required all commercial shipping fleets operating out of coastal ports to transition away from traditional diesel engines by the end of the decade. My brother had inherited a logistics empire built entirely on outdated infrastructure. His company operated 240 heavy-duty diesel trucks. He had financed the maintenance and expansion of that fleet using variable-rate commercial loans. When the Federal Reserve aggressively raised interest rates 4 times in 18 months, his monthly debt service quadrupled. Julian was not a villain, sitting in a leather chair, plotting my demise. He was a desperate man, drowning in an ocean of corporate debt. He possessed a rigid management style that worked in stable markets, but shattered under regulatory pressure. He refused to downsize his warehouse footprint. He refused to liquidate his older vehicles when the secondary market was still viable. He believed he could simply outwork the collapsing margins. By the 4th year, the bank issued notices of default on his primary commercial properties. His loading dock sat empty. He was bleeding capital every single day, trying to save the legacy our parents built. While his empire crumbled, the state initiated the Mojave Solar Nexus project. California allocated billions of dollars to construct a massive renewable energy grid across the desert basin. They needed to move gigawatts of harvested solar power from the interior valleys directly into the Los Angeles metropolitan grid. The civil engineers drafted their transmission blueprints. They immediately hit a geographical wall. My 500 acres sat directly across the only topological pass that could bridge the desert solar farms to the coastal substations. To route the high-voltage cables around my property would cost the state contractors an additional $90 million in raw materials and labor. To route the cables through my property, they had to navigate the federal wildlife habitat protections and the subsurface mineral claims I had meticulously filed years earlier. My barren dirt was no longer a tax liability. It was the absolute center of a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure choke point. A corporate development firm named Helios Dynamics won the primary state contract. They did not call me to negotiate. They sent a team of litigators to my apartment on a Tuesday evening to deliver a formal notice of intent. The negotiation process was not a sudden windfall. It was a brutal, protracted siege. The corporate lawyers sat in my small living room and threatened me with eminent domain. They stated the government would simply seize the tract for public utility use and pay me a fraction of its assessed agricultural value. I did not flinch. I opened a manila folder and handed their lead counsel a copy of my federal land use restrictions. I calmly explained that declaring eminent domain would trigger a mandatory federal environmental impact review. I told them a federal review would stall their state construction subsidies for at least 5 years. I knew they operated on strict quarterly deadlines. They did not have 5 years to wait. We entered formal mediation. The process consumed 11 months of my life. I was still working my daytime auditing job. I spent my nights sitting in sterile, windowless conference rooms across from highly paid corporate attorneys. They employed a strategy of physical and financial attrition. They flooded me with thousands of pages of technical discovery documents, hoping I would miss a single filing deadline and forfeit my leverage. They tried to bury me in procedural motions. The toll on my body was severe. I lost 14 pounds. I developed a chronic tremor in my left hand from continuous cortisol exposure and sleep deprivation. One foggy morning in February, I actually fell asleep at the wheel on the interstate. The massive blare of a commercial truck horn snapped me awake just as my tires hit the shoulder rumble strip. I pulled over and threw up my black coffee onto the asphalt. I lived on pure adrenaline after that. There were mornings I sat in my car before work, gripping the steering wheel with shaking hands, wondering if I should just sign their initial lowball offer so I could finally sleep through the night. But every time I looked at their term sheets, my training took over. I analyzed their numbers. I saw their profit projections. I knew exactly how much my land was worth to their bottom line. I refused to surrender a single inch of leverage. I countered every legal injunction. I attended every single hearing. As my mediation entered its final, critical phase, Julian began searching for liquid capital to prevent the bank from foreclosing on his warehouses. He leveraged his remaining political connections in the county zoning department. A regional planning commissioner casually mentioned the unprecedented surge of corporate surveying activity surrounding my desert parcel. Julian pulled the public records. He discovered the proposed transmission route. He realized the dirt he had mocked 5 years ago was suddenly highly strategic. However, Julian made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed my financial reality remained identical to the day I lost the probate lawsuit. He assumed I was still working multiple jobs, drowning in property taxes, and desperate for any immediate cash flow. He believed the corporate litigators were currently crushing me. He saw an opportunity to acquire the deed from me for a minimal price, flip the land to Helios Dynamics himself, and use the corporate payout to save his failing logistics company. He justified this plan by telling himself he was rescuing me from a legal battle I was too weak to win. A thick cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was a formal invitation from my brother. He requested my presence for dinner at his primary residence in the Hollywood Hills. The note attached was brief. He wrote that it was time to put the past behind us and discuss a mutually beneficial financial arrangement regarding the desert property. I knew exactly what the invitation meant. He planned to offer me $200,000 for the deed. To a struggling warehouse worker, that number sounds like total salvation. To a forensic auditor who had just spent a year bleeding out corporate attorneys, it was a profound insult. I looked at the tremor in my left hand. I thought about the fiancé I had lost. I thought about the years I spent freezing in a grocery distribution center to pay the taxes on the dirt he threw at my chest. I did not reply to his note. I simply marked the date on my calendar. I called Marcus Thorne and gave him the address of my brother's estate. I told his corporate team to bring the final contracts there at 8 o'clock if they wanted my signature. I purchased a tailored charcoal suit. I packed my leather briefcase. I prepared to walk into his grand dining room. I drove up the winding roads of the Hollywood Hills. The Los Angeles evening air was unusually cold. The wind rustled through the dry palm fronds lining the street. I parked my sedan behind a heavy iron gate. The gate was unlocked. It hung slightly off its hinges. The front lawn of my brother's estate was overgrown. The sprinkler system had clearly been shut off for months to save money. Dry brown grass crunched under my leather shoes as I walked to the front entrance. I knocked on the heavy oak door. The sound echoed hollowly against the canyon walls. Julian opened the door. The physical deterioration of his face was undeniable. His posture sagged. The sharp, tailored confidence he wore at the law firm 5 years ago was gone. His collar was frayed. Dark circles framed his eyes. The interior of his home was vast and stark. The walls were bare. Faded rectangular outlines marked the spots where expensive artwork used to hang before the liquidators arrived. Our footsteps echoed off the marble tiles as we walked down the long hallway. The silence in the house was heavy. There was no staff. There was no music. There was only the sound of our breathing and the distant howl of the wind outside the panoramic windows. We entered the grand dining room. A massive mahogany table dominated the space. 5 years ago, he had smirked at me across a similar table. Now he stood at the edge of the wood, holding a crystal decanter. The glass clinked against a tumbler as he poured himself a drink. His hand trembled slightly. The liquid splashed over the rim. He did not offer me a glass. He took a long swallow. He pulled out a chair for himself. The legs scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. He gestured for me to sit opposite him. I remained standing. I held my briefcase by my side. He began his pitch. He used a low, methodical tone. He spoke about our parents and the legacy of the logistics company. He explained the current market difficulties, using careful corporate jargon to mask the reality of his impending bankruptcy. He framed his past actions not as theft, but as a necessary protective measure for the family assets. He claimed he always intended to bring me back into the fold once I matured. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the polished mahogany surface. The paper made a soft scratching sound. It was a personal check. The printed amount was $200,000. He stated the desert parcel was a burden I no longer needed to carry. He offered to take the dirt off my hands to save me from the property taxes. I looked down at the check. A dark, bitter sense of irony washed over me. 3 years ago, standing in that freezing grocery distribution center, $200,000 would have been a miracle that saved my life. Tonight it was just a piece of trash. I did not yell. I did not point out the blatant manipulation. I simply observed the tremor in my own left hand. The lingering physical evidence of my year-long mediation battle. I thought about the freezing nights in the grocery distribution warehouse. I thought about the sound of my fiancé dropping his apartment key on the kitchen counter. I had paid for this exact moment with pieces of my youth. I placed my leather briefcase onto the mahogany table. The brass latches clicked sharply in the quiet room. Before I could open it, the heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded. The noise reverberated through the empty house. Julian looked confused. He excused himself and walked down the hallway. I heard the heavy oak door swing open. I heard unfamiliar footsteps entering the foyer. Marcus Thorne walked into the dining room. The chief executive officer of Helios Dynamics wore a precise navy suit. 2 corporate attorneys flanked him. They carried thick leather portfolios. Thorne did not wait for an introduction. He did not acknowledge my brother. He walked directly to my side of the table. I had explicitly routed him to Julian's address to finalize this exact moment. We had spent the last 12 months locked in brutal financial combat. We had exhausted every legal maneuver available in the state of California. I had cornered his energy firm into a non-disclosure buyout by weaponizing federal environmental statutes and subsurface mineral rights. He was not here to save me. He was here to finalize his defeat. Thorne opened his portfolio. The zipper made a sharp tearing sound. He extracted a thick stack of finalized contracts. He placed them next to my briefcase. Then he withdrew a single certified bank document. He laid it flat on the mahogany table, right next to Julian's personal check. The stark white paper contrasted against the dark wood. The printed numbers were bold and precise. $15 million. The exact compensation for the total acquisition of the Mojave Tract and the relinquishing of all my developmental blockades. Julian stepped back. His leather shoes squeaked against the floorboards. I watched his eyes dart wildly from the $15 million certified statement to his own pathetic $200,000 personal check. The visual contrast was absolutely devastating. His ego dissolved right there on the mahogany wood. The air left his lungs in a sudden ragged gasp. He tried to form words, but his throat clicked dryly. His hands grabbed the edge of the table to steady his weight. He realized, in that fraction of a second, that his manipulation tactic was useless. He realized the worthless dirt he threw at my chest 5 years ago had just orchestrated his final ruin. His logistics empire was days away from foreclosure, and the sister he discarded now possessed more liquid capital than our parents ever generated in their lifetimes. I signed the acquisition documents. The scratch of my pen was the only sound in the room. I slid the certified bank statement into my briefcase. I fastened the brass latches. I did not offer Julian a share of the money. I did not offer him a parting insult. I picked up my bag and walked toward the exit. The corporate team followed me out. I stepped onto the front porch and walked to my car. The Los Angeles night sky was dark and starless. I sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel. The leather felt cold under my palms. I was undeniably wealthy. My financial independence was permanently secured. I would never have to work a night shift in a freezer again. But as I started the engine, I felt the profound weight of the victory. The money bought my freedom, but it cemented my isolation. I had permanently severed my last remaining blood tie. I had traded the soft parts of my humanity for ruthless tactical efficiency. I drove down the winding canyon road alone. I won the war, but the silence in the car was deafening.